Hey Cox Cougars, it's Miss Leaf here, and we're going to be reading chapter 6 of Finding Goby today. And since I want you to know your purpose for reading today, I'll tell you that your question at the end will involve characterization. So, just a quick review, you can tell a lot about a character in a book by their words, their actions, their looks, their thoughts, and their responses, both how they respond to situations they can encounter and how others respond to them. So keep that in mind as we're reading through chapter 6. We will pick up on page 43, chapter 6. Dion stumbled toward the car. As he got closer, the two men inside jumped out. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. "Do you want some water?" "I need to sit in the car," Dion replied. "I don't feel very well." That was an understatement. He felt awful. His head was pounding and his chest hurt and his vision was blurry and he felt as if he was about to throw up or fall down or both. But he hoped that sitting in the car's air conditioning for a few minutes would make him feel better. It did at first. The cold air felt amazing. Dion just sank down into the seat and closed his eyes. He thought he'd never feel cool again. When he opened his eyes, he saw the car's dashboard display. "Does that really say 132 degrees?" he asked. "Yeah," said the guy behind the wheel. Both he and the other volunteer were watching Dion closely. He knew that if they thought he couldn't continue, they might force him to quit for the day. He couldn't let that happen. "Can I have the water?" Dion asked instead, pointing at a water bottle sitting in the drink holder. The volunteers nodded, and one of them handed him the bottle. It was so cold some of the water was still ice. Dion drank it down and ate one of his energy gels as well. Then he sat back and waited. But he wasn't feeling any better. In fact, now that he'd gotten used to the air conditioning, he realized he was actually feeling worse. His head was spinning and he could barely focus his eyes. The band across his chest was getting tighter and tighter, and each breath was a struggle. "Come on," he muttered to himself. He knew that he needed to get back outside. Every second he sat here was a second he lost in the race. But somehow he couldn't make himself move. And just thinking about going back out into that heat again made his heart race even faster. Dion discovered he was panting for air. Then he noticed the volunteers watching him in the mirror. He must have looked as though he were dying. For a second, Dion wondered if he was dying, but he refused to believe that. He still had a race to run, and a wife waiting back home, and family and friends, and a small dog he just knew would be sitting there at the finish line watching for him. He couldn't let her down. To distract himself, Dion asked about the only runner ahead of him. "How long ago did Zhang come through?" The driver shrugged. "About 20 minutes before you?" Dion asked at the last checkpoint and had gotten the same response. So Zhang had only had a 20-minute lead until all this. "How did he look?" Dion wanted to know. The other volunteer shook his head. "Not great," the man admitted. He was struggling a lot and just walking. Dion sat up straighter. Walking? If Zhang was walking, he must be out of energy too, which meant Dion could still catch him and take the lead. That was all the motivation he needed. With a deep breath, Dion grasped the door handle, shoved the door open, and stumbled out of the car. It was like walking into a wall of heat, and he had to squint against the blinding sunlight. But he managed to straighten up and then to put one foot back on the path, then the other. He was doing it. With each stride, his confidence returned and his pace improved. Soon he was running again. Not as fast as he had before, but that was fine. It was enough that he was heading in the right direction and maintaining a somewhat decent pace. It didn't last, though. After running a few hundred feet, Dion found he had to slow to a walk. He walked to the next flag, then ran from there to the one beyond. Then he walked again. It wasn't the fastest process, but right now it was the best he could manage. Soon he'd forgotten all about trying to catch up to Zhang. Now Dion just wanted to finish the day's run and go collapse in his tent. Eventually, he reached the top of a sand dune and saw the day's finish line up ahead. And waiting near it in the shade was a certain bundle of sandy brown fur that sat up and charged him as soon as he was close enough for her to be sure. Dion smiled as he lurched over the finish line. Gobi had run the last few hundred feet with him, though after that she ran back to reclaim her spot in the shade. Zhang was already there, as was another runner, Brett. They both waved, and Dion waved back. He'd have to find out later if he'd made up any of that time. For right now, though, it was enough to know that he'd completed the day's run. He was still in the race. Thinking about that made Dion remember where he'd been this afternoon. He spotted a race volunteer and hurried toward him. "Any news on Tommy?" Dion asked. The volunteer smiled. "It's amazing," he answered. "They got him cooled down, and eventually he started running again. Filippo's with him, and they're doing okay." Dion nodded. Filippo was a Swiss runner and a nice guy. Tommy was in good hands. For the first few minutes after finishing, Dion just rested. He drank more water, too, and petted Gobi, who was thrilled to be reunited. Eventually, Dion got up and wandered the camp. Along the way, he spotted a clipboard listing the runners' times. He, Brett, Zhang, and another runner named Jax were the only racers who'd finished today's run so far. But then he saw Zhang's time and groaned. The Chinese runner had beaten Dion by 40 minutes. Dion knew there was no way he'd be able to make that up. There was only one more day of running, and it was a shorter distance than the others, a nice, easy run to finish out the race, which was great if you were just out to run. But if you were looking to catch up with someone who was more than half an hour ahead, you probably wouldn't ever catch him or her. There just wasn't enough time, which meant he couldn't win the race. But after allowing himself to be frustrated for a few minutes, Dion took a deep breath, because now that he thought about his placement today and what had caused it, he realized something surprising. To help someone in need was more important than any race result. It was another couple of hours before Tommy finally arrived. Filippo Rossi was with him, and though they were both clearly tired, they made it across the finish line together. People were crowding around Tommy, congratulating him. Everyone had heard about how much trouble he'd had, and the fact that he'd still managed to complete today's leg was nothing short of amazing. Then Tommy spotted Dion. Next thing Dion knew, the runner was pushing his way through the crowd. Everyone pulled back to give them a little room, and then Tommy was throwing his arms around Dion and hugging him tight. "Thank you," Tommy said. There were tears in his eyes. "Thank you." Dion found that he was having a hard time keeping his eyes dry, too, so he nodded, acknowledging the thanks. Then he turned away. The tent felt like an oven, but Dion was too exhausted to care. He inflated his mattress and sank down onto it. With a short bark, Gobi hopped up as well and turned in a tight little circle before settling down beside him. Dion nodded and patted her head, but his mind was already starting to drift and his eyes to close. The next thing Dion knew, he was asleep. Dion woke to his tent mate Mike shouting at him. "Get up!" his friend yelled. Dion blinked. Why did the tent seem so much shorter than usual? Then his brain kicked in and he understood what had happened. The tent had been blown down, and judging by the noise howling around outside, they were caught in a sandstorm. Dion grabbed Gobi and crawled outside. The sand stung his hands and face, but he did what Richard instructed and lay down on the tent to keep it from blowing away. Everyone was rushing around and shouting to be heard over the wind. Dion waited for someone to come by and help set their tent back up, but no one did. Finally, he and Gobi went looking. They found a woman named Nurali who sent the men around the tents to fix them. They argued about the tent. Nurali said they would fix it, but it could be a while. Dion said they'd already been waiting a while. In the end, Nurali just walked away. The storm continued, and by midnight they heard that it was only going to get worse. The organizers finally decided to abandon the camp for the night. They gathered all the runners together against a row of low cliffs nearby so they could have at least some shelter from the wind and dust and sand. It didn't help much, but Dion and Gobi made the best of it. Around dawn, a bus arrived. It took the runners to a national park nearby. The park had a small museum by the front entrance, and all the runners hurried inside. Dion kept Gobi close to him. Gobi was having fun. Admittedly, waking up in the middle of a storm hadn't been pleasant, but crawling out of the tent